Hello, this is Brother E for Trains in Transit. Today we're going to discuss railroads on stilts, or more specifically, the first elevated railroad that was erected in New York City in 1868 by inventor Charles T. Harvey. Now, of course, the elevated railroad was as old a concept as the subway, probably even older, because people, let's face it, were looking for relief from the congested areas of lower Manhattan. You had the horse car that had been in operation in New York since the 1830s. You had the omnibuses and other forms. But the horse car was the main mode of mass transit. But being on the ground, while it made the ride smoother and caused urban boundaries to be expanded, it still added to the overall congestion in its center city. So ideas and means are being discussed to alleviate that overcrowding. So, sometime around the 1840s, drawings and renditions of would-be elevated trains were coming into play, and none of them got very far. Some of them involved viaducts along the sidewalks where horses or horse cars would traverse. You'd go on one side of the street, the horse car would be on top of this thing, and at the second story rooftop, at the second story levels of local structures, and the horse car would run one direction and run the opposite direction. Of course, what was not really mentioned, what was obvious, was the fact of horse droppings falling into the street, which would have definitely happened, and nobody was anxious for that. Um, so these were various proposals that went on and took place, and they went nowhere for obvious reasons. The public wasn't interested. They wanted to alleviate overcrowding, but they weren't going to go there. Now, the obvious answer, by the time these lines became seriously considered, was why not do a subway? Well, London put a stop to that because London opened its first subway. It was sort of like an open trench. What they did is they built an open trench, pretty narrow, just about 20, 30 feet. Then they would brick it over, and then at periodic intervals, I don't know how many miles, maybe quarter or so mile, you'd have these openings, which the steam from the steam engines would vent. Well, even traveling a quarter, half, or a mile underground with steam blowing into your cabin is not a pleasant experience. So nobody there really liked the idea, especially in New York, of an underground steam railroad any more than they liked one steam railroad in city streets. So Harvey was a very diminutive man, born in 1820, died I think in 1914, lived a pretty good life. He came with the idea of a cable-operated elevated railroad. And it was like in Greenwich Village someplace. I think it was grounded in Greenwich Street, the lower Manhattan. It was supposed to go up to the Harlem River. That was the original concept. So at various intervals, he would have a steam engine to move the cable, much like you would later have in San Francisco with the cable system, Andrew Holliday's system. It was perfected in 1873, a few years later. So Harvey got the state assembly to approve of this, and he did it under the nose of boss William Marcy Tweed, who for about a decade and a half or so, maybe 20 years, dominated New York politics. He was the ultimate grafter boss, if you will. And he somehow got it through the legislature, and Harvey was able to build like a half-mile stretch, lower Manhattan. And I don't know which it's the original rail cars. It's open. It doesn't carry vehicles. It's like a regular rail car or a work car, or something like this. In order to demonstrate the feasibility of it, he built this quarter-mile stretch during the construction, initial quarter-mile stretch, and he had a photographer positioned as spectators, investors, and so forth, watched him demonstrate the line. It's a very popular photograph, very widely known. And what distinguishes it, and what later distinguished the pillars of the Ninth Avenue Rail, which grew out of this particular inaugural line, was the fact that the columns would go straight up, and then just shortly before they reach track level, they would hold the tracks. They would sort of like branch out like a tree, like they flange out. It's hard to explain, but you'd have this solid column. Then it got up, then it would branch out, and that would hold the track. You'd have the cable operating underneath it. And the investors were impressed with it. And the line opened for service. You'd have about two vehicles, um, cable operated. You wouldn't have a steam engine, nothing. You just have a regular car like you have a cable, one car. And it would have a grip, a primitive grip, and it would be pulled by a moving cable on the trackside. And for the brief time that system was in place, it did pretty well in terms of moving people about. It didn't really ease congestion on the scale people wanted because it was just still experimental and there wasn't enough to it. However, the cables kept snapping and people got stranded 20, 25 feet above the ground and they had to be rescued by ladders or, depending on how close they were to buildings, through the second stories of surrounding structures, neighboring structures. And, with frequent delays due to cable repairs having to be made, the line quickly fell out of disfavor and it was abandoned sometime in 1870 and so forth. And it was sold for something like $900 for the whole thing. And it was fully expected to be demolished. Well, by this time, Boss Tweed had gotten wind of it and was doing everything to stop it, because what Tweed had in mind was to build an elevated railroad, but in the form of a concrete viaduct structure from the Battery all up to the Harlem River. And this would have cut right through the center of Manhattan Island, right through Central Park, everything. You see, that type of massive construction project meant graft. And he and his people would profit immensely from the construction, overcharging for concrete, steel, metal, whatever it took to build everything. They would execute eminent domain to carve a swath, destroying untold thousands of homes. They would mutilate Central Park, because they were not planning to go around Central Park. They were planning to cut right through the center of it, up to the Harlem River, and maybe even beyond. And this monstrosity, if it had been built, would have ever altered the landscape of New York, and it would have basically destroyed it. It would have destroyed Manhattan that we know today. So the people, actually the same individuals who had forced Harvey out, by trying to have his original L condemned, and who had since converted it to a steam operation. We have steam locomotives running back and forth instead of the cable system by 1870, 71. The same individuals who undermined Harvey went to him for help, because Harvey knew a lot of powerful people. And one such individual, I forget his name, I have to look it up. He went to bat for Harvey in the state assembly and defeated Boss Tweed's bill. That started Boss Tweed's downfall, which occurred a few years later. He was eventually convicted of many crimes, sent to prison, and died behind. He eventually fled to Europe, was captured overseas, walked back to the U.S., tried again and convicted, and died in prison. But that's another story. The L was saved, and to the consternation of a lot of people, frankly, because the steam locomotive, even though it initially covered up in a wooden whatever, it was designed to avoid scary horses, so you wouldn't see this big cylinder belching steam. They did that for a while, but it was eventually abandoned, and they adopted called tiny, phony steam locomotives that would go back and forth, rear-ending and so forth. And that went on for a while, and it led to the 1875, starting in 1875, the 9th Avenue L was two-tracked, double-tracked, and so forth. It was reinforced to accommodate heavier equipment, heavier engines, heavy wooden cars. And it was around that time that things went, the L went full bore in Manhattan. And so lines went up they went up over 3rd, 6th Avenues in 1878. And in 1880, the L was put over Second Avenue, and these lines immediately went from one central terminal of the Bowery to the Riverside, the Harlem River up in New York. And even though people raged at being burned by cinders, awnings, it was not uncommon for awnings on the side of the tracks to be set on fire by passing trains. The L proved very popular in relieving congestion. The problem is, you're talking about the start of that great wave of immigration into the United States in the Lower East Side, basically around around the area the Brooklyn Navy Yard used to be, and Fulton Street. That was a major. This and Ellis Island later came into play. So the influx of immigrants overwhelmed the relieve the siphoning off of population in the crowded sections of Lower Manhattan, and the L's expansion northward on the island foretold the role the L would play and the subways for decades to come. Namely, that when the Ninth Avenue Well, you see pictures of 1876 before the Third, the Sixth Avenue, Second Avenue lines. You see pictures of the Ninth Avenue Well being built in completely rural, vacant areas in Upper Manhattan. That didn't last long because with the L, more so than the horse car, the L enabled for rapid filling in of these vacant lots. People, real estate developers would buy up properties. They'd build homes. A lot of the brownstones we see that line the structures. And it expanded the urban boundaries of Manhattan. These people forget that Manhattan Island alone didn't become fully urbanized until the L came there. And this pattern was followed throughout the 1870s and the early 1880s. In fact, in 1886, the Third Avenue L expanded into the Bronx, and it would keep expanding there until 1920 when it reached Gun Hill Road, which connected by then to another elevated line that had been built a few years earlier, part of the gold contracts. So the L proved itself to be a catalyst. And in 1885, the L entered Brooklyn. It was called the Lexington Avenue line. It went from Grand Street, I think, in downtown Central Business, Brooklyn. And it basically stopped at Gates Avenue and Broadway in Brooklyn, one block. And it expanded. That opened in like May of 1885. And by December of 1885, the line had stretched eastward along Broadway to Fulton Street. The curve was at it is now Broadway Junction, East New York, near where the rail yard is, and the J and E Z lines. And that stopped at Van Sislen Avenue. And in 1885. And so what you had later on was the line expanding to later on was the line expanding to Cypress Hill Cemetery, and that was where it ended in 1893. That's another story. I'll go into that later. So around these lines, there was great expansion. Eventually, the L reached 168th Street and Jamaica Avenue in Queens. And that was part of Jamaica L. In fact, I have a piece of the old Jamaica Avenue L right here. When they cut back the Jamaica line, which is part of the original L in New York, they cut it back to Queens Boulevard in 1977. And in 1985, the Queens Boulevard station, which was built in 1918, one of the newer stations, was demolished. It was closed in April. It was in April of 85. And I went there and that summer in July, and they had a debris field to keep people from under the staircase to keep people from climbing into the abandoned station. And right here is a slab of the Jamaica Avenue L, demolished. The Queens Boulevard recently closed, and I picked it up. So I don't know how I didn't get arrested, but I somehow managed to get through this barrier and grab this piece in July 22nd, 1985, and I've had it ever since. It was part of the station, or the staircase of the old Jamaica line. And it's it's kind of funny. If you're an L fan, a transit fan, you'd like to grab hold of things. The L was the main catalyst. I mean, it was such a huge catalyst for expansion that in 1892 they started building them in Chicago, the South Side Line. The first part of the Chicago South Side Line opened in 1892. Went down from the center city, later the Loop, to the Chicago Exposition of 1880, 92, 93. And a few years later, they opened another system called the Lake Street L, which is still operating. And then after that, called the Mets L. And you see behind me, to the over there, is a map of the Met system. That was printed in 1898. And when I went there, the section on the upper left-hand corner, a little stretch called the Douglas, well, that's the only thing that was really left in its original form when I got there. And in 89, 91, and in 2000, 2002, I went there frequently. Why? Because the remaining section of the Met, dating to 1895, Douglas branch, was falling apart literally, to the point where they had to have metal shielding to keep cars from being destroyed, from falling debris. Trains were limited to only 10 miles an hour on the 1895, 1896 stretch. And you'd have debris fields. And so what I'm going to show you here is literally, it's pretty heavy. This right here is a piece of the Douglas L. Bolts and all. This is what they call a flange that was attached to the stringers that held the tracks. It would go perpendicular to along the stringers. This is pretty heavy. The original bolts, the original chunk of steel, this dates to 1893, 1894 when it was built. That's the Douglas L. I keep it as a souvenir, much to the consternation of the wife, but hey, it's a part of history. It was a part of the line in that upper section when that map was made in 1898, or at least in the original map. But all of this is to say that when the L came, things changed. Of course, people didn't like the steam operation in Chicago any more than they liked it in New York. But then Frank Sprague, the one who electrified the street railway system successfully in Richmond in 1897, later transferred that technology to the elevators. First in Chicago in 1899, and then to Brooklyn 1900, and then finally into Manhattan in 1903 with multiple unit control. But that's for a future podcast. So in the meantime, the L became a fixture. And the L's were going to remain a primary means of mass, or in this case, rapid transit, until electrically powered vehicles could be viable, because there was no way in hell they were going to allow a steam operated system underground in New York. So once Sprague's system, Frank Sprague, the engineer Frank Sprague's multiple unit control electrical system was proved viable in Chicago, Brooklyn, which was in the original city until 1898, Manhattan in 1903. Once that was already established, when they started constructing the subway, that was the system that was going to be used, and it's been used ever since. I think it's AC. The L brought a lot of noise, a lot of shadow, and then up until the time of electricity, a lot of chaos in the form of falling cinders from passing trains. The noise levels didn't necessarily decrease when the conversion was made to electric vehicles because basically you have steel rails rattling against steel superstructure. And that's you have that sound vibrating off the surrounding structures. That's just going to be a noisy situation. So more about that in a future podcast. I hope you enjoyed this one and see you next time.